Running backs are certainly important. We can't deny the impact that they have for their teams. But what if I told you that the key to production for a running back has very little to do with the running back themselves? The value of running backs has been one of the most hotly debated topics over the past decade or so in the NFL. While it's traditionally thought of being as a crucial position on a team, it's now generally believed to be one of the easiest positions to replace. And it's also believed that a lot of the production that backs have relates more to the offensive scheme that they play in, their usage, and perhaps most importantly, their offensive line. Let's take a look back at 10 running backs that owe their careers to the talented O-line they ran behind. First up, we have a guy who is an NFL Hall of Famer, 2-time Super Bowl champ, and has 5 Pro Bowls and 3 All-Pros to his name. Former Miami Dolphin, Larry Csonka. The burly 6'4", 240-some-odd pounds fullback was one of the most feared runners in the game back in the 60s due to his stature. He developed a reputation amongst opposing defenses for being one of the least fun guys to tackle. Jeff Seaman, a linebacker from the Minnesota Vikings who faced Csonka and his Dolphins in Super Bowl VIII, summed it up after the big game saying, "It's not the collision that gets you, it's what happens after you tackle him. His legs are just so strong that he keeps moving. He carries you. He's a movable weight." But for all the might that he ran with, there's a legitimate reason to believe that he was largely a product of those amazing Dolphins offenses, particularly their star-studded offensive line. It was anchored by Jim Langer and Larry Little, both of whom were surefire Hall of Famers. Langer earned 6 consecutive trips to the Pro Bowl and 6 consecutive All-Pro selections from 73 to 78, and Little notched 5 Pro Bowls and 5 All-Pros between 1969 and 1978. I hate to diminish what Csonka accomplished on what was quite literally one of the single greatest teams in NFL history, but it's hard to look at his career in a vacuum because he had so much talent around him. During his 3 1,000-yard seasons, the most losses the Dolphins had in a season was 3. And after he left the Dolphins, his production fell off a cliff. During the 3 years he played for the New York Giants, he averaged under 4 yards a carry, going from 3.6 in 1976 to 3.5, then 3.4. A far cry from his peak in 71 and 72 when he was running behind that dominant Miami O-line while averaging 5.4 and 5.2 yards a pop respectively. Doesn't seem like a coincidence to me. Speaking of running backs who played on all-time great teams, how about former Dallas Cowboys star Emmitt Smith? While Smith obviously had a very productive career, the question has been asked over the years, just how much of that was due to the ridiculously talented offensive line that he ran behind? I mean, if you ask most NFL historians, they'll point to the Dallas O-line of the 90s as being one of the single best units that the NFL has ever seen. Look at some of the names that blocked for Smith. Mark Tunney, the Cowboys left tackle, earned back-to-back trips to the Pro Bowl. Left guard Nate Newton was a 6-time Pro Bowler and a 2-time All-Pro. At center, Mark Stepanowski was a 5-time Pro Bowler and named to the All-Decade team. And when he got injured ahead of the 1993 playoffs, they slotted in John Gesick, the team's right guard who filled in seamlessly. And perhaps the best lineman on the entire unit was Eric Williams, aka Big E, whose physicality and aggressive blocking style set the tone for the rest of the group. There is a reason that they called those 90s Cowboys offensive lines the Great Wall of Dallas. No one was getting through them. Not to pile on Cowboys fans here, but the Emmitt Smith experience was honestly pretty similar to what we've seen from other Dallas running backs in recent years, just minus the Super Bowl rings. And that, of course, is Ezekiel Elliott, who, like Smith, has had people starting to murmur that maybe he wasn't this generational talent worthy of being taken number 4 overall in the draft after all. Rather, maybe he just ran behind one of the best offensive lines in the league for the first few seasons of his career. Actually, regardless of what you think of Zeke's talents, the idea that he ran behind a truly elite offensive line is an undeniable fact. When you have absolute monsters at tackle like Tyron Smith and La'el Collins, Zach Martin at guard, and Travis Frederick at center, the reality is that there are gonna be some pretty epic holes to run through. I mean, Tyron Smith is now getting up there in age, but the man is a freak of nature. He is 6'5" and 300 plus pounds of pure muscle. I wouldn't be surprised if the guy was under 10% body fat, which at his size is pretty dang absurd. Oh yeah, and he just so happens to have been named to 8 Pro Bowls, 4 All-Pros, and the NFL 2010's All-Decade team. His trench mates aren't too shabby themselves either. Frederick has made 5 Pro Bowls and 3 All-Pros, and Martin was selected to 7 Pro Bowls and 6 All-Pros. So yeah, pretty safe to say that Elliott has been a big-time beneficiary of this beastly unit. And unfortunately, he just isn't the same back without these superstar linemen paving the way. This has become more and more obvious in recent years, as those guys have aged and continued to battle with injuries. In fact, both Zeke's yards per carry and cumulative numbers have been down over the past couple of seasons, largely, in my estimation, because Smith has missed more time than he has ever before in his career. According to StatMuse, Elliott's yards per carry, yards per game, and rushing touchdowns per game are all down significantly in the games he's played without Smith on the field. In 61 games with a beast of an O-lineman, he averaged 4.6 yards per carry, 88.4 yards per game, and 0.69 touchdowns per game, compared to 4.2, 73.4, and 0.54 in 26 games without him. Not to mention the fact that Elliott's running mate over the past couple of seasons, Tony Pollard, has been far more efficient than him, despite running behind the same exact offensive line. At least Zeke has shown his line some appreciation over the years, even if fans and media want to give him the bulk of the credit for Dallas's run game. Someone had to do right by the big fellas, and who better than Elliott? It will be interesting to see if Zeke can evolve and perform consistently going forward, or if perhaps he's going to hit a wall like one of his peers, Le'Veon Bell, did when he no longer had that fearsome Steelers O-line to run behind. Because in Bell's case, it has not been pretty since he left Pittsburgh. He went from being a perennial Pro Bowler and All-Pro guy to all of a sudden hardly being able to crack a starting lineup. Save his one season with the Jets in 2019 when he posted an abysmal 3.2 yards per carry across an entire season. And in the 2 seasons since, it hasn't really been any better. He's gone from Kansas City to Baltimore to Tampa Bay, all teams with high-powered offenses, and yet both his usage and production has remained in the cellar. Many are starting to suspect that Bell's All-Pro years in Pittsburgh were actually a product of that Steelers offensive line rather than Bell's pure running ability, especially considering the relative ease with which James Conner filled the void that Bell left in 2018 during his holdout season. This came as a shock to many because Conner was an unheralded former third-round pick who had posted under 35 career rushing attempts heading into that season, and Bell was considered at the time to be a true superstar talent at running back. But as it turned out, Conner slotted in no problem, averaging 4.5 yards per carry, half a yard more than Bell. By the end of the season, Conner was named to the Pro Bowl, and all the leverage that Le'Veon thought he was going to gain during his holdout disappeared into thin air, just like his career after he left Pittsburgh. To make matters worse for Bell, he didn't exactly leave the Steel City on good terms with the guys that made his career the success that it had been up to that point. As his holdout carried on, multiple members of the Steelers' offensive line spoke out against Bell, and Ramon Foster went as far as to call out the fact that they were the guys making his production possible. Former Seahawks Shaun Alexander is yet another running back who quite clearly looked to be the beneficiary of a top-tier offensive line. Take a look at this touchdown run from his MVP season in 2005. I honestly think that just about anyone, football player or not, could have made it into the end zone with this kind of hole. I mean, you could have driven a Mack truck through that bad boy. And while not all his touchdowns that year or during his career with Seattle were that easy, the fact remains that he was very, very fortunate to be running behind an offensive line featuring superstar talents like Walter Jones and Steve Hutchinson. They were the real drivers of that offense. And even Alexander himself knew it. We go to hotels, you have as many people screaming for them as you do our quarterbacks, said Alexander. You were like, did we really hear them screaming for linemen? Matt and I just kind of laugh. We have rock star linemen. It was a similar situation for Priest Holmes in Kansas City as well. He went from being an undrafted platoon back for the Ravens to Offensive Player of the Year and a 2-time touchdowns leader behind that Chiefs offensive line. Look at the splits from 2004 when Holmes played only half of the season due to injury. In 2004, Larry Johnson and Derek Blaylock averaged 4.8 and 4.6 yards per carry respectively in Holmes' absence. The following year, Priest was supplanted by Johnson as the full-time starter, and Johnson immediately became a Pro Bowler, averaging 5.2 yards a carry for 1,750 yards and 20 tutters. All of a sudden, even Holmes' best years had to be taken with a grain of salt. And for that matter, so do Larry Johnson's numbers. Because the second that the Chiefs' O-line took a turn for the worse, LJ's production fell off a cliff. And once he left KC, he flamed out of the league entirely. Both he and Holmes really deserve just a fraction of the credit for those Chiefs running offenses, especially compared to that O-line with all-time greats like Brian Waters and Will Shields leading the way. Kinda like what we saw with Terrell Davis. When Davis went down with an injury in 1999 following his insane MVP campaign in 98, a little-known rookie named Olandis Gary stepped in and immediately became a 1,000-yard rusher despite only playing 12 games. Not to mention that Gary had a better yards per carry than Davis did in the 4 games before he went down. It's hard to argue that Davis doesn't owe a lot of his success to that fearsome Broncos offensive line, which uncoincidentally featured 3 Pro Bowlers in '98, being Tony Jones, Mark Shelrath, and Tom Nalen. Now, this is not a personal attack on the running backs we've talked about. The truth is, running backs have been carried by their offensive lines for as long as football has been played. Think about the stark contrast of a guy like O.J. Simpson's production. In 1972, Simpson averaged 4.3 yards per carry, which, while respectable, pales in comparison to what he did the following year, averaging 6 yards per carry, which just so happens to coincide with his offensive line transitioning from having 2 rookies on it in 72 to 2 Pro Bowlers in it in 73. And if you want to go back even further, how about Jim Taylor on those mythical Packers teams from the early 60s? Vince Lombardi had put together one of the most fearsome offensive lines that professional football had ever seen, with guys like Jim Ringo, Jerry Kramer, and Forrest Gregg, all of whom would go on to be Hall of Famers. Not to mention Packers guard Fuzzy Thurston, who was an all-pro in his own right. Yeah, Taylor still had to run the ball during those 1,000-yard seasons he posted, but there's no denying that he owed a huge chunk of that production, and really his career, to those big men on the line, blasting open holes for him to run through. But which other NFL running backs owe their careers to their offensive line? Did we miss anyone? Join us in the comment section below. If you like this video and learned a thing or two, clicking the like button helps out a ton. And hey, we appreciate it. If this is your first time coming around to TPS though, subscribing is a great idea because we put out videos like this every single day. But as always, thanks for watching and we'll see you guys next time.